philosophy anymore. It's been replaced by the study of epistemology, and that means how do we know what we know? And they love that. And they ask questions like, it's about how we gain knowledge. How do we know what we know? So they're fascinated with questions like, is this the chair or a chair? That's their life. But this question about reality is fascinating because it's central to our lives. Everybody is walking around with a theory of reality in the back of their mind, even though they're not conscious of it. When you decide you have, you've saved a few $1,000s and you decide to use those few $1,000s on buying a car as opposed to paying for a course in college, you're operating on a theory of reality, even though that's a fancy way of putting it. When you donate money, when you have a few dollars in your pocket and you donate money to a charity, instead of going to Hardee's and having a breakfast, by the way, they have a wonderful breakfast sandwich, but you're operating on a theory of reality. What is real? What motivates you to do what you do comes from this inner theory of reality that everyone is walking around with. If you're philosophically minded, then you know the name for it is ontology and you begin to think about it. But most people never really do think about it. Okay? And Plato or Aristotle were fascinated by this subject, although again they didn't call it ontology, that came much later. They were especially interested in the interplay between ideals, abstract ideals, and their material representations. In other words, abstract ideals and the way that they appear in the material world. Remember the example we always use is the ideal of a square versus its material representation. An ideal, or a form, as Plato says, is really kind of a definition, a universal definition. So we know definition. So it doesn't matter where you live, what language you speak, what century you live in, the universal definition of square is a rectangle, which means a four-sided object with four equal sides and length, and four equal angles. And the material representation is this, something like this. So, I mean, that's just a simple example of what they mean. They were interested in the interplay of the ideal, or the definition, and its material representation. And they both agreed that reality is made up, for the most part, of these ideals, forms, or definitions, but not to the exclusion of their material representation. So the question is, why did they emphasize this? And there were two reasons. Number one, this is perfect, and these are to varying degrees not. There's no way that you could equal this, even with computers or robots. You could never come, to varying degrees, they're not perfect. And if you get the right definition, this is forever, and this has a shelf life, as in like this. Here it's gone. Or if I had made it out of wood, eventually it would rot. Or if I made it out of sand, the tides would wipe it away. If I made it out of iron, it would rust and wither away one way or another. But if you get the right definition, it's forever. Now I want to show you this. This is gone, right? Right? Yeah. Well, let me do this. Is that gone?
The writing's gone.
No, but is it gone?
Yeah.
But it's not, because if you understood this, if you understood in your mind, not your brain, but your mind, proper definition of the square is it would be with you forever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I erased it from the board, but it's gone. When I erase this, or the tides erase a sand-made square, or salt in the air, rusts a square made out of iron, and the list goes on and on, those really are just gone. So because this is perfect and this is not, and because this, if you understand it properly, remains in your mind forever, this is assessed to your mind or imagination, and the material representation is assessed through your senses. Okay, so, and they called that classical realism, the belief that reality is made up mostly of a universal ideal. But not to the exclusion of the material representation. And we didn't, so we made up numbers, we used to say 60-40 or something, but they're not, they don't talk that way, but I just wanted to illustrate it for the class. Now, are there any questions about that? Now, what's interesting is that just like philosophers are not that interested in this anymore and spend most of their time on this, the definition of classical of realism has changed as well. So, and our understanding of Plato has changed, because even though he makes this very clear, he's now considered to be an idealist. Now, so I brought the Republic to show you that if you read, and you remember in all of our classes we insisted on close textual analysis. I mean, how could somebody stand up before a class and tell you about what someone believes unless you saw it for yourself? So I just wanted to remind you of this famous passage in the Republic, and it really is pretty famous. How you could miss this, I have no idea. Let me get the page down, I wrote it down. Let me set the stage for you, and then I'll read it slowly. And you know, he's talking to people in Athens. He goes on walks and talks to people in Athens, and they ask him. He's well known for being open to questions. So people ask him a question, and his typical response is,
"What do you think?"
What do you think? And then the discussion begins within everybody who's standing around. Because he wants you to come to a realization of the truth, not memorize what he's telling you. So one of the people around him, and they use the fancy term interlocutor. What is the definition of interlocutor? I see that all the time. These are the people who are talking to him, and they call them interlocutors. Tell me what that's in your dictionary. Locutor. Interlocutor. For me, it is just the people he's talking to.
One who speaks.
One who speaks.
A person who takes part in a dialogue or
That's
conversation.
it. So there you go.
Person
So
with
that is a good term. Yeah, so, yeah. So one of the interlocutors says, "Can anything be done as it is said? Or is it the nature of acting to attain to less truth than speaking, the nature of acting to attain to less truth than speaking, even if someone doesn't think so?" Socrates had been describing in his words what he considered to be the ideal government. So they want to know, we hear what you're saying, is this ever going to take place? Is it going to take place next week in Athens? Is it going to take place 100 years from now in Pittsburgh? Or on and on and on. So he says, don't compel me necessarily to present it, this ideal form of government, this ideal, this definition of a just government, don't compel me, Socrates says, necessarily to present it as coming into being in every way indeed as we described it in speech. But if we are able to find a city could be governed in the way most closely approximating what has been said, say that we found the possibility of these things coming into being on which you insist. Or won't you be content if it turns out this way? You found a government that was kind of like this, but didn't match the ideal. And Socrates, I, for my part, would be content. So here's this existing government in Des Moines, Iowa, that only comes partway to meeting his ideal of a just government. And they want to know, is that okay with you? And he says, yes, for my part, I would be content. So he says, so what we must try to do is seek out and demonstrate what's badly done in cities today by this ideal, and thereby keeps them from being governed in this way, the ideal, and with what smallest change, preferably one, if not two, and if not the fewest in number, and the smallest in power, a city would come to this manner of regime. So what he's saying is, here's the definition of an ideal. We know that just like the definition of a square, you'll never find a perfect regime like this on Earth at any time, in any place, in any space. So the interlocutors want to know, so then why are you bothering us with this? I mean, if we can't see it, if we can't live in it, if we can't smell it or touch it or hear it, so what? And he's telling you because it forms a standard. Remember you say that's what people don't understand when we talk. It forms a standard with which to judge the material representation of governments. And once you understand that standard, then we all have an obligation to try to make that materially existing government be as much like it, the ideal, as possible. Now, how do you know how many changes? 1, 2, 3, or 4? And his answer is, it depends on the history of that city, the history of that state, the history of that country, the history of that region. I mean, we keep making this, we're really not interested in that. We keep making this mistake in our foreign policy. We're going to make South Vietnam be just like Sacramento, California, with a city council, democratically elected, yada, yada, yada. So Plato would say, but you can't do that, because they have different histories. Maybe, if luck has it, Saigon in 1,000 years will be a democratic society like a democratic city, or South Viet, kind of like Colombia. But it just can't happen like you're saying it. We wanted to make Iraq and Afghanistan. And the presidents and secretaries of state and secretaries of war would say, we'll invade them, send in 100,000 troops, and the people will welcome them as their saviors, instead of look upon them as invaders, trying to impose a foreign kind of government on them, and they know nothing about it. They care nothing about it. They can't. It's just not their experience and vocabulary. So that's what he says. With what smallest change history will allow. Unless, I said, I meaning Socrates, the philosophers rule as kings, or those now called kings and chiefs genuinely and adequately philosophize, and political power and philosophy coincide in the same place, while the many natures now making their way to either apart from the other are by necessity excluded, there'll be no rest from ills for the cities, my friends, nor I think for humankind. Nor will the regime we have now described in speech ever come forth from nature insofar as possible and see the light of day. So that's the point. Here's the ideal. Do you agree with it or not? Let's have a discussion. And basically, what was the ideal, do you remember? If you ask people, they'll say, well, a philosopher king is ruled over workers. But really, what was his ideal state? Where people do the job for which they're best suited by birth and by experience. Okay? And in that state, Oprah Winfrey, who's a wonderful woman, hardworking, honest, who truly brought herself up by her bootstraps. She didn't inherit $1 million from her parents. And has been a woman of great integrity. But those talents don't translate into running the complex American government with separation of powers and federalism and etc. Selling soups is not the same thing as running a complex government in a complex world. Notwithstanding the fact that she's a wonderful woman. So Oprah Winfrey is different than Donald Trump in the kind of persons they are. But she's identical to Donald Trump in that she has no experience whatsoever. So she has found her calling. First she started out, remember, with a talk show that was very, very popular. Then she became a producer and a director, and then she sells books. And last time she was selling soups. Did you see those commercials? You know, ecological soups, and I'm sure they're delicious. And her show was very entertaining. And the movies she makes and stars in are remember The Color Purple, and I mean, they're wonderful. But that's not the same talent as running the United States of America. And then when we had this, when I went to hear your presentation, I kept going, I'm not going to get involved in this. You didn't tell me that, but I didn't want to get, rain on your parade. I'm not getting involved in this. She asked me to come to, she gave a presentation for her thesis.
I knew the risks.
I'm not going to get involved, I'm not going to involve. And then all of a sudden they start talking about the purpose of education, because that was indirectly involved in what she was doing. And it was clear that her teachers were convinced that it was to get a job. And I kept saying to myself, I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to say, and then it just kept getting deeper and deeper into this technical aspect, as if you were going to fall, her education, a master in philosophy at the University of South Alabama, was like going to become a welder at Faulkner, She wasn't going to be a welder, but she was going to have a job, learn the techniques of having a job. And I couldn't contain myself anymore.
I remember.
And I said, and that's what Plato says. So the purpose of it, and you find out through education what you're good at. And education is supposed to help you, not tell you, but help you learn what you're good at. And then pursue it and learn how to be the best at what you are born to be.
To create citizens is
Well, basically, everyone has to be, but that's only in a democracy. I mean, he's not, as you know, he's not a big fan of democracy. Because in a democracy, we get people ruling us like Donald Trump and Oprah Winfrey, because they're very popular. I've often wondered, aren't the people that supported Donald Trump surprised by the crap he does? And then I finally reached the conclusion, no, that's what they wanted. They got exactly what they wanted. So what is that old saying, you made your bed, now lie in it.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, what Plato is saying about the city and the state and the government of it.
Well, he's using that as an example of a larger question. The theory of political justice is an important question, but it's not as important as what is reality.
Well, yeah, and what is reality being? Well, what is the purpose of government? Aren't those two things linked?
To create just relationships between people.
So this is the idea of the telos, what the telos is.
What's
of
the intrinsic purpose of something, and the intrinsic purpose of government is to create just relations between people.
I was trying to.
And between people not only in one society, but societies all over the world.
You can apply this idea of the telos to nearly everything, right?
Sure.
And we were trying to talk about
Because
what the
that's how
telos
you
is of
find
a
the
person.
ideal. You want to know what is the distinct, unique purpose of something that nothing else can do.
What is that for a man?
Well, that's an excellent question, and that's really the key question. You can do a square, you can do a squirrel, you can do, remember the example used of an oak tree and an acorn,
And you can do a
a
government.
human being. So we have to find out what is it that only a human being can do and no other living thing can do. So what is it?
Create.
No, elephants. Have you ever seen the drawings that elephants do when they put them in museums? They put a brush in his trunk and he just kind of he's looking and this is a tree. Someone says, "Oh, he's just done a tree." To know the difference between right and wrong and act on that knowledge, only human beings can do that.
On the rational part of the soul.
Huh?
On the rational part.
Well,
of
when
the
the rational part of soul rules over the sensory part with the aid of the spirit, when you have that in balance, then you're able to do that. Know what's right and wrong. But just like everyone has a view of reality, everybody has a view of what's right and wrong.
But also not just to know, but also to act on,
Well, but
in
first-
accordance with the right.
Yeah, but
Okay.
first it's you asked what's the telos of a human being?
Human
That
being,
is
yeah.
to be able to know the difference in right and wrong. The difference between right and wrong.
So is that something we're born with or something we're taught
That
to
comes
do?
with the territory of being a human being. And
You-
that's why human beings,
Are intrinsically born with this, with this.
by nature,
Okay.
So that God made us in His image.
that's what it means in Genesis. Yeah, it doesn't mean that your eyes are the same color as God's. You know what I mean? It means we have that power, and that's quite a power. That's quite a power. And it also means that since we're the only living things that know the difference between right and wrong, then we have to take responsibility for our freely willed decisions. That's called free will. And that's what comes with the territory of being a human being. And that's why slave societies and totalitarian societies are anti-human places to live. Because they seek to deny us. That's why they're so unjust, because they seek to deny us. I mean, they can't take away our free will, but they try their best to deny us from exercising it. And that's what makes them evil. And that's why Lincoln hated slavery, and that's why Roosevelt wanted to defeat the totalitarian governments of the world, led by Hitler, because he knew that they were evil governments.
And the totalitarian
They want to have
regimes-
total control over you, including your ability to use your will. Instead
And
of it-
decide what's right and wrong. Don't they tell you?
They
what's
tell you what's right and
wrong?
wrong. You can't take away a human being's soul or free will, but you can murder them if they try to use it.
So
That's why they murder hundreds of millions of people.
is having a soul
Comes with the territory.
equal to having the ability to distinguish between right and wrong?
That's the religious way of talking about that freedom, yes.
Okay.
That's exact. And that's your soul, in religious terms, connects you to God.
Which is like kind of like the author of the ideals, if you know.
So God is the
The-
author of the ideals, and your
the
soul
standard.
connects you to God and His knowledge. Now that's why in Genesis human beings are created last. I mean, that's because we're the highest creatures because of that. We're created in His image. And you remember Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, remember the sight? God is touching Adam with his finger, and Adam puts his finger out. And that's what that means, that God is imparting that power, that supreme power to human beings. And we talked about how that creates a dilemma, because the first decision that human beings make on their own is to eat the apple, which is just a metaphor for trying to gain knowledge for themselves. So this dilemma in the Judeo-Christian tradition is God gives us that power, but punishes us, we leave paradise and suffer and die, which is things that would never happen in paradise, because we were going to do what we were able to do, and God gave us the power to do. I don't know how you explain that.
Having the ability to make a decision like that probably brings with it some sense of you're going to make a wrong decision. You're going to make wrong decisions, and you'll suffer for the wrong decisions, and hopefully the right decisions will take you closer to the standard.
But that's what makes human life more exciting and more interesting than the life of any other living thing, because we make wrong decisions. A turtle doesn't make wrong decisions. A tree doesn't make wrong decisions. But human beings do. And so from the time we're born to the time we die, we're always trying to figure out we're going to make wrong decisions to minimize them and maximize the good decisions we make. And we do that, I suppose, from learning from experience and from learning from other people's experiences. So I keep telling him, I don't want to lessen he says, I'm so excited to take these classes, and I keep saying to him, well, be careful, they're not going to be that exciting. I said, and when I spoke up to classes that weren't exciting, I always suffered for it. I suffered terribly. I mean, the teachers didn't like what I was saying, and they punished me for it. Here's a good example of it. This summer we visited Israel for the first time. It was very exciting for us. So we went to Atlanta to visit my daughter, and then instead of having to take a plane from Mobile to Atlanta, and then to New York, and then to Israel, we figured we'd kill two birds with one stone. We'd go and visit her and her children, our grandchildren, and then take a plane from there to New York and then on to Tel Aviv. One of the stops would be eliminated. So just like what happens in Atlanta almost every day, they delayed a flight, which meant we lost our flight in New York. Which meant we had to pay $200 to stay in the hotel overnight to catch the next plane to Tel Aviv the next morning. Well, they didn't have a flight that was direct, so we were going to have to go to Switzerland. So we're on a long line of hundreds of people whose lives have been screwed up. What must have happened, I mean, they gave all kinds of baloney explanations. What must have happened was they couldn't fly. They have these union rules about pilots can only fly so many hours and stewardesses. So that's what probably caused the delay. But it was out of the hands of hundreds of people who were on this long line. So we get on the long line. This is like at 10 p.m. The plane was supposed to leave at 6. We got there at 10. So we couldn't run down flag the plane down. We finally get in front, and they said, well, you go to Zurich, and you'll get on a plane to Tel Aviv. So you'll only miss it'll be a 10-hour delay. I said, are you sure about this? And they wrote on the ticket, certain. So sure enough, we get to Zurich, we present the ticket, and they say, we have no idea who you are and what. You'll see where I'm going with this in a second. You'll see how I always get into trouble. I said, what? So we begged them. Of course, none of these people speak English, so. Finally, they said, well, the best we could do is you'll stay another night in Zurich for another 200 piastres or whatever the hell they have in Zurich, and then you'll take a plane next morning to Turkey. And from Turkey, you'll go to Tel Aviv. And I said, well, what airlines are we taking? They said, you'll be taking the Edelweiss airline. I'm going, oh, shit. This was supposed to be a lifetime trip, wonderful trip, visit the Holy Land. Edelweiss Airlines. What are we going to do? So finally we get to Turkey. It was a resort city. And it's not like other airports. It's like you get off the plane and there were all these gates. You couldn't find where the gate was for Edelweiss Airlines. So there's this cop walking around with a machine gun, and I made the fatal mistake of saying to Sue, let's ask him. So he doesn't speak English, but he makes it clear he wants to see our passports. Listen to this story, and I couldn't believe it. It ruined our whole trip, as you'll see. So he's carrying a big gun, so we give him our, and then he starts mumbling visas. We have to pay him a lot of money in visa fees. So I keep saying, but it wasn't our choice to come here, and we're not staying here. This is just a stop-off place. And then I start grabbing for my passport because I could see where this was going. And Sue grabs me, and I say, no. And he starts to raise his machine gun. So we make such a fuss that he finally calls the boss, which happens to be a young woman, an Orthodox Muslim with the whole headdress. And she can speak a little bit more English than, listen to this, you couldn't make this up, a little bit better English than the cop with the Uzi, which was ironic because Turkey hates Israel, but they're carrying an Uzi. So, and I'm trying to explain to her, we can't pay you a visa. And she said, then you have to go back to Zurich. I said, we ain't going back to Zurich. And she goes, well, that's too bad. And the guy with the gun is now lowering the gun. I'm not exaggerating. So finally I scream out, you're missing the point. Who the hell wants to be in Turkey? Like, what the fuck am I doing in Turkey? And finally, I mean, the tone was, the words and tone were as direct as at a weak point I use. And all of a sudden, this woman can speak English. And she says to me in clear English, she says like this. A second ago, she couldn't speak English. She says, well, you're in Turkey now, buddy. That's exactly what she said. At this point, Sue falls to the ground, and she's not acting, and starts crying.
Oh, no.
And I start walking in circles, still trying to find a way to grab our passports from this freaking cop with the machine gun, thinking that since she's on the floor crying, she can't hold me back. So she didn't do this dramatically, but the woman starts to feel sorry for her, and she takes the passports away from the guy and gives it back to us. And she takes us, we have to go out on the, what do you call it, where the planes,
Tarmac.
the tarmac, and we have to walk around, and she finally takes us to the gate, where we had to sleep. We weren't going to pay another $200 for a hotel, so we just slept on a chair. Finally, we sat on the floor until we went to Edelweiss. So we come 2 days late. In the meantime, we had made reservations at a hotel. We had to pay for those 2 nights to keep our reservation. So here's a guy, who I'm giving you advice, but I can't follow the advice. So I was trying to say to him, many of these courses will not be edifying, but just keep your mouth shut and do it because it's a means to an end. What I should have done, now this is 3 months later, is taken out $20 and given it to the cop, and he would have given me my, instead of shooting me dead, he'd given me my passports back. You're not in Turkey now, buddy. She said, it's clear-cut English, as if she lived in Brooklyn. But the whole hajib, and it was remarkable. So that's what I'm saying to him. I don't want to discourage him, but I want him to understand that you're just going to have to put up with this because someday you'll have students that you'll mentor. But it's a means to an end, that it has to be done because you have to have the credentials in order to do the teaching you want to do and have an influence on young minds, which I think you were born to do.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you're interested in learning, and you want, instead of just imparting what's the capital of Argentina to people, you want to impart an interest in learning that you have, that you inherited from your mother, And you wouldn't agree with it, but probably from your father, at least, or at least his ancestors. It doesn't come from nothing. Everybody's born with a certain talent. So the question is, how do you find what that talent is, and then how do you develop it? How do you go to the right training to develop it? But first you have to find out what the training is. So that's what he thought was the purpose of education. So they thought that in a just society, a good education system is the single most important institution. And that's the irony of the fact that of all of the courses that are given in universities today, the education degree is the biggest joke of all. Isn't that sad? How sad can that be? And those are the people who voted for Donald Trump. And knew what they were getting. I'm convinced that they knew what they were getting, and that's what they wanted. They wanted a guy who was going to be 180 degrees different than George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And that's what they got. Because this guy certainly is quite different than them.